Utroin Alevis Vicleni Ian Uishlas Gunni Corgalier, Gohere, Gunnioga, is Minla Maringeta, Chess, Weekus a Gwoliv, as actor Curitiok, the Slarts and Alskrish on you, an Okoid, Tovoktaksha, the Tusakarla Kogal are over, 4 Hovok doing Galer, Dane Lahas, Stelishtanakt, Unentus Yorba. I'm absolutely delighted to be here with you today, and may I thank Dr. Ben Tonra, Dr. Aidan Regan, and Dr. James Cross for organising this debate on the critical topic of democracy and popular legitimacy in the European Union. When European political economy was heavily informed by philosophy and ethics, its conceptual strength was, I believe, impressive. And we should never forget that Adam Smith of The Wealth of Nations is the same person who wrote the theory of moral sentiments some years earlier, or indeed that the two texts are deeply connected. What has happened then, we might well ask, to the field of public economics and its discourse, with what implications for its decision-making structures that were previously perhaps located in traditional democracy, to have given so much ground to the influence of unaccountable rating agencies. Acting as a modern panopticon, not bound by any requirement of democratic accountability, these agencies are increasingly coming to define the life world and prospects of European citizens in all of the member states. So what can be done? The formulation of a discourse on such issues as the possibility of, for example, having a pluralism of responses that would enable the member states of the European Union to address their citizens' concerns on unemployment at historic levels in so many countries of the European Union, and particularly among the young, poverty, social insecurity, and a growing inequality that in the Western world is revealed by, for example, the achievement of disparities among the richest and the poorest that are at about the level that are prior to the crash of 1929. I believe it is both urgent and important to address these questions, to ask what is this Europe of which we speak, this Europe that we might wish to communicate. What is this essence that would be the content of such a communication? Let me begin by saying that there are many whom I've met, indeed as I've met as heads of state, who have been quite appalled by a crude division of the European Union in terms of North and South, or worse still, in terms of creditor and debtor members. We need to have a different approach towards our present position in relation to the European Union in terms of the crisis that has been identified for the subject of this discourse this afternoon. As Jacques Delors put it, we need to rekindle the ideal, breathe life and soul into it. That is the essential imperative if we intend to give shape to the Europe that we so dearly wish for. And this afternoon, while it would have been attractive to me, as always when I go back to visit universities, to ask about this Europe, what is this Europe of which people speak? Is it the Europe of the street, the Europe of cathedrals, the Europe of empire, the Europe of revolution, or the Europe of culture and of the arts? This afternoon I limit myself to respect on simply the possibilities of moral ethical inquiry in making its contribution to the deepening democratic discourse and practice in the European Union. I'm taking my cue from the title of the invitation in this initiative, which underpins today's seminar, Communicating Europe. The questions I wish to raise are simple, but I believe may be fundamental ones. How do we talk about Europe? How should we talk about Europe? And of what Europe are we speaking? And what some of the finest contributions to an answer to these questions to this debate in recent years have come from Jürgen Habermas. His work provides the starting point for any analysis of the philosophical and political questions facing contemporary Europe. Aspects of his work also, I think, perhaps point to the limitations which have held back the debate on the issues to date. In his book in 2012, Under Weber's Shadow, Dr. Keith Breen of Queen's University Belfast has offered a measured and constructive critique, I believe, of Habermas's work. It is a critique which I believe to be of relevance to our discussions today. And I draw on this scholarly work to suggest that Jürgen Habermas's dualistic theorization of the political space, as important as it may be, as elegant theoretically, curtails certain essential citizens' capacities. More particularly, Habermas's dichotomy between what he calls life world, the life of the family, the world of the family, civil society, and the public sphere on the one hand, and then what he refers to as system, that is, the realms of the state and the economy, leads him to privilege civil society and the public sphere as the sites of emancipatory politics, and to erode important possibilities for conscious intervention and change in the administrative and economic arenas, and thereby stifling labour's role in the identity formation. I believe, of course, that Habermas has made an invaluable and indeed often a lonely contribution, and that it is important for us to critique that economic theory and policy, which has, by elevating a technicist version of economic policy, invoked tension with the elected democratic institutions of the European Union, and indeed made and threatens to make those institutions fragile. In fact, much of what my own previous speeches have dealt with are a kind of response, as it were, a response to the Weberian nightmare delivered. Here it might be useful, perhaps, to unpack some of the key concepts at stake in Habermas's critique. As Dr. Breen convincingly showed in his work, Habermas is deeply responsive to Max Weber's vision of the modern condition, as resulting in two closely interrelated developments: the process of rationalization, of ever greater knowledge specialization and technical mastery, which in late modernity peaks in Weber's terms to an iron cage of bureaucratic routine, and as Weber put it, mechanized petrification. And secondly, the process of disenchantment, concluding with the individual's abandonment to a radical polytheism of conflicting values, none of which can claim rational superiority. Habermas does not deny that the modern age is torn by conflicts of values, threatening the bonds of solidarity, but he disputes the Cartesian version, the Cartesian vision of the self that is perpetuated by Weber, one that reduces reasoning to a solitary activity and thereby fails to account for the intersubjective dimension of human life and the power of communication. Later, if I refer to phronesis, for example, it is as the opposite to techne. And I see in this Aristotelian dependency that is there in some of the work, note the distinction, for example, between poiesis and praxis, between that for which has a known end and that which is free, or that which is limited in its purpose and its technical, and that which is, as it were, taking account of the full human being, as essential concepts that I have not the time to develop just now in relation to the debate about the role of the expert, the definition of the economic view as the view of an expert that is different from society. As Habermas defines it, communicative power is this fragile potential of a common will formed in non-coercive communication. In Habermas's view, this communicative power, that is the attempts of ordinary subjects to reach understanding through speech, is the key principle of what he calls life world or symbolic reproduction. He's referring to such processes as cultural knowledge transmission, social integration, or importantly, identity formation. Moreover, as far as Habermas is concerned, the losses in freedom and meaning which Weber rightly identifies with advanced modernity are the result not of rationalization per se, but of a stifling of free communication in the realm of the life world by a competing instrumental principle governing the material that is the systemic reproduction of societies. Habermas thus develops a two-level theory of society, which locates the crisis of modernity in a boundary conflict between life world and system, the former being characterized by communicative action and a telos of mutual understanding, whereas the latter, the economy and the administrative state, adhere to instrumental and strategic logics that are governed by the criteria of efficiency and success and are immune to moral normative considerations. And now we are at the heart of what is the possible crisis of which we are debating this afternoon. And here it should be noted that in Habermas's view, the system, which includes the realms of the state and the economy, conceived as a technical entity, is not in itself detrimental. The growth in systemic complexity associated with the development of capitalism and modern welfare states did occasion a huge expansion in material well-being, and in any case, a return to the enchanted is simply impossible. Dr. Breen, for example, analyses Hannah Arendt and Alistair MacIntyre, as well as Habermas, and of course that phrase about return to the enchanted is something that might be hurled at Alistair MacIntyre's work. Systemic logics become destructive, however, when they affect irreplaceable social capacities that are grounded in the life world. Habermas uses the term colonization to describe the process by which life world needs and roles are translated into systemic imperatives dictated by the state or the market. He understands this colonizing force as a systematically induced reification, impelled by commodification and juridification. Private lives become commodified when the market transforms individuals with unique personalities into consumers with standardized preferences, tailored to the requirements of capitalist production and consumption. On this process, there is now, of course, a large body of literature, including the work of Zygmunt Bauman or of the more radical Slavoj Žižek. Habermas's concept of colonization is worth perhaps a little further elaboration. His warning against the effects of what he calls systematically distorted communication arises wherein creeping instrumentalism induces subjects to think of themselves and their life worlds in terms amenable to the maintenance of markets and administrative control. It is especially useful to critically analyse, for example, European Union projects such as the Lisbon Agenda, the Europe 2020 strategy, and their related measurement criteria, under which every domain of human activity, including science and the arts, is measured against the ultimate goal of economic competitiveness alone. There is an old literature on this, if you like, which I spoke of in another paper. I gave about how, for example, we make the journey from reason as a concept in philosophy to the rational, to the calculable rational, to, for example, then what James Scott refers to as cadastral mapping. Habermas provides some valuable analytical tools with which to examine the current crisis, the EU's response to that crisis, and the consequences of both on the very fabric of European societies. As Habermas sees it, the effects of colonization, as he puts it, are starkest when systemic crises are curbed at the cost of endangering the transmission of cultural knowledge, and in the process disrupting, for example, transgenerational solidarity, and impairing citizens' cognitive, communicative, and emotional capacities. What is at stake, therefore, is far more than the individual's freedom of action or the meaning of certain value commitments, but rather the irreducibly interpersonal conditions by which freedom and meaningfulness can endure at all. In the Irish context, We need only think of the social impact of mass immigration, for instance, to grasp the consequences of an engineered consensus congruent with the imperatives of financial power, or push it further back to look at the experience of the famine. In his recent work, Habermas has very strong words to describe this capture of life-world resources for the benefit of systemic stability. The mass of those who are not among the winners of globalization, he argued, will now have to pick up the tab for the impacts on the real economy of a predictable dysfunction of the financial system. Unlike the shareholders, they will not pay in money values, but in the hard currency of their daily existence. Habermas's analysis are thus of great value, enabling us to grasp both our modern condition and the significance of the current crisis. Why then is his dualism problematic? The problem is that Habermas's dissociation between system and life world induces him to surrender such vast arenas of human endeavour in what Weberian terms would be called mechanized petrification. A difficulty stems from Habermas's conception of civil society as the realm of wild, unorganized spheres of opinion formation that enjoy unrestricted communicative interaction and are free to thematize all issues. In the terms of the context of the social media, huge issues arise with this. Habermas values such civil society contexts, however, because of what he sees as their informal and non-colonized character, in contrast to the power-ridden, formal character of parliaments, state administrations, and private corporations. In fact, such privileging of civil society is a recurrent feature of contemporary political thought. Civil society is often cast as a sole salutary resource upon which we are to rely if we are to rescue the European Union from what is called its democratic deficit. It is presented as the sphere that might best enable the recovery of citizens' communicative and participatory capabilities. Now, while it is true that civil society does indeed encompass pivotal forms of intersubjective life, its weak politics, as Habermas puts it, are not immune to, but on the contrary, permeated by power inequalities generated by the wider economic and political structures. Moreover, as Habermas himself acknowledges, the democratic potential of the public sphere is rendered ambivalent by the constraints and new hierarchies of electronic mass communication. Should Habermas's civil society publics, therefore, provide the central focus of European citizens' energies and emancipation strategies? In Alistair McIntyre's work, a resounding yes is given. Yet I would like to suggest that the markets and administration, because they are dominant institutions of modern life, must be reclaimed as areas amenable to transformation, critical reflection, and moral ethical inquiry. And I believe that this is of vital importance for the future of democracy in the European Union. If the mediating role of political parties in contest for public support is weakened, if the role of organised labour or business is to be abandoned, then politics in the public space is vacated for the benefit of the extremes. We need to locate the role of expertise, then, within an accountable system where its function is to clarify choice, not serve as substitute for collective deliberation. The current encroachment of expertise and technocracy over democratic debate is threatening the future of our polities. Acknowledging the embeddedness of ethical ideals with the economy and administration is, I suggest, one of the surest means to debunk some of the theoretically fragile, in terms of its undeclared assumptions, expertise that is directed at citizens who are dismissively assumed to be economically illiterate. As Keith Breen put it in his work, genuine expertise is a modest expertise, different in degree rather than kind, to the phronetic wisdom of ordinary subjects. In the economic realm, then, the idea of transformative practice entails overcoming Habermas's strict dichotomy between instrumental and communicative reason. If we accept, as Habermas suggests, that they are necessarily governed by some form of latent functionalism. We need rather to affirm strongly that the market is not a norm-free realm, and that there is scope for our insistence in placing individual discretion and accountability within it. Just one other point. What constitutes work, I believe, will be a fundamental question in our coming decades. And it is important to recognize how the material and the symbolic are interrelated in workers' lives and identities. And here I praise Alistair MacIntyre's formulation of practices, for example. Indeed, the thesis according to which the extrinsic structures of material reproduction invade something intrinsic, symbolic reproduction, has the effect of surrendering labour and human beings' productive capacities to the functionalism of system. Was it the social and psychological significance of one's work and with it, the social and psychological significance of one's work and occupation, their role in forming social identities, are suppressed. The concept of citizenship, then, in the European Union cannot be commodified, reduced to a unit of consumption or a flexible unit of migratory labour or unprotected labour, without calling into question the aspirations to a just European Union and abandoning it at best as something rhetorical. In the political realm, therefore, it is necessary to reaffirm a substantive vision of citizenship that goes beyond the current formalism attached to versions of European citizenship. Indeed, as Hannah Arendt powerfully argued, mature citizenship demands meaningful participation within the plurality of institutions that together form the state, and where the power to change states of affairs can be regularly and accountably seen to be at stake. And in my speech to which you refer, President, in the European Parliament last year, I argue that a robustly democratic European order requires a strengthening of the role of both the European Parliament and national parliaments, and deeper integration between their respective deliberations. It requires an emancipatory path that avoids rigidly opposing communicative power to administrative power. It requires what Dr. Breen has described as an interplay of institutional imagination and cautious experimentation, utilising the possibilities for an institutionalisation of communicative fora within formal organisations and state bodies. The institution of ombudspersons, for example, or a judicial hearings are but examples of such possibilities. With all this in mind, is it not possible to find a new language to talk of Europe, one that renders more central and more clearly audible the moral, ethical underpinnings of European integration, a language that is informed by both the legacy of European thought and the knowledge systems that preceded any divisions between Eastern and Western intellectual traditions, or any divisions between revealed or civilizational suggestions as to truth. If I may go back then just one more time to Habermas, it is important to stress how in giving the bonds of intersubjectivity their due, his philosophy helps us capture the substantive quality of the European project. Indeed, where Weber identified the struggle for denomination, the unrelenting contest of will between leaders, factions and states as the fundamental condition of modern political life, Habermas, on the contrary, suggests that both personal and political maturity can be achieved through a gradual acquisition of reflexivity and reciprocity. The European project is grounded in the recognition that societies and nation states, after all, are not self-referential units. The EU member states are united by a sense of interdependence and accountability, a realization that even when they disagree, they are dependent on one another for their continued existence and willing to engage their antagonists, as George Sorel put it, without hatred and without the spirit of revenge. The recognition of interdependence, the institutional embedding of mutual accountability, and the sharing of sovereignty can be interpreted as a sign of maturity, Europe's coming of age after the terrible ordeals of the 20th century. Such a reorientation towards intersubjectivity, accountability, pluralism, is profoundly meaning in our contemporary world, as we commemorate the centenary of the outbreak of World War I, recalling how Europe sleepwalked into war, as we watch in dismay the unfolding crisis between Ukraine and Russia, as risks of armed conflict on a large scale are discernible elsewhere in the world, we should seek to understand, reflect, and speak of what it is that Europeans gained in displacing oppression as a mode of international relations. The full capacity of a deepened democracy in life and institutions has, of course, yet to be achieved. The ethic of pluralism is embedded surely in the very procedures as they might be in European decision-making. What is usually decried as an overly complex and hence non-transparent process can also be a means to ensure that all points of view are heard, those of large and small countries alike. In principle, the community method or the co-decision procedure, when I as minister participated in 20 years ago, that legislative shuttle between Council and Parliament, they have the potential of fostering reflexivity, bringing each institution to submit its position to reflection and critique. This substantive content of the EU's institutional framework, the meaning and ethical significance of its complex decision-making procedures, needs to be made more explicit. Communicating with each other as mutually respected citizens in a union that is cohesive, that acts in solidarity to its external and external challenges, is a greater, more urgent and rewarding project than dreaming of any strokes to communicate what has not been defined. In my view, elected representatives, both at national and European level, can with great benefit engage in a discussion over the normative and ethical implications entailed in particular policy choices. They are challenged to be clarifiers and mediators in the complex and contradictory entanglement of socioeconomic inequalities at national, European and global level. And such a role of clarification and public justification is an eminently democratic one. It is not about foreclosing the definition of the common good, but about pointing up options and what they might mean morally, and then respecting the citizens' capacity to come to their own considered moral and political judgments on choices. The rise of Eurosceptic populists in contemporary Europe, with national identity as their rallying cry, points very plainly to European citizens' current perceptions and growing discontent with the current course of the European Union. Ironically, this national populist upsurge might well force us who care for the future of European integration to engage more resolutely in an exercise of normative clarification and articulate more clearly the significance of the European project in order to go further on the basis of a set of economic pluralist models that are responsive to the varying conditions of our peoples in social and demographic terms. The real difficult challenge then lies in our ability to reconnect the definition of European common goods with what European citizens regard as good. And this entails, I do realize, more than bringing out the normative content of institutions and procedures. It is my conviction that in order to deepen democracy in the European Union, we must engage in an ethical discussion that goes beyond the limits of a discussion on constitutional guarantees and political norms as technically defined. The ethical discourse we need has to do with self-understanding and self-clarification, with the meanings and purposes around which groups form and sustain themselves, with how individuals craft a life that they have reason to value. Through social interactions, actors not only come to express their beliefs, make assertions as what is them is true, proper or necessary, but also, particularly in the Western rational tradition, they offer reasons for this. Once that is recognized and properly valued, it becomes possible to recast our structures of power as being dependent upon justifications arising within the everyday life world of citizens, and their right to dream and realize alternative futures. And beyond all that, they feel free to speak of a world possible but not yet probable. All this has important consequences as to the conceptions that underpin scholarly work and policy making at national and European level. Civil servants within the European Commission, leaders at the European Council, member states' bureaucracies tend to focus on the testing of the ability of macro-sociological systems, sometimes a single macro-sociological system. that a model that is untested, to adapt to an unstable and complex environment with which such as the crisis has presented us with. Such an exercise, however, can never be decoupled from an understanding of the internal life world perspective of European citizens without a significant democratic cost. Systemic approaches are valuable, of course, and can even be essential insofar as they allow us to grasp complex processes in a mode sometimes inaccessible to ordinary perception. When the purchase of a commodity in one context fuels economic exploitation elsewhere, for example, or when an industrial relocation from one member state to another can be seen as benefiting or suggested as benefiting the Union as a whole. However, what European democracy requires is that any systemic perspective be rooted in an understanding of the practices, perceptions, aspirations, and everyday realities of Europe's citizens. Such perceptions and everyday realities are the wellspring of good administration and democratic legitimacy in the European Union. Or to put it in Habermasian terms, life world should never be reduced to the status of a mere environment or appendage to the instrumental action of the administration and the market. And this also means I want to finally suggest that a greater pluralism is needed in the academic disciplines that inform what has been called European expertise. The European system, with its dedicated academics, civil servants, lobbyists, think tankers, and miscellaneous professionals, draws its intellectual resources mainly from the three disciplines: political science, economics, and law. These three disciplines need, in my view, to be reintegrated with philosophy. Economics, in particular, should, in the faces of the current crisis, critically re-examine its claims to science truth. It should have the confidence there should be the confidence in the discipline to see itself as a craft rooted within ethics and utilizing, of course, the finest of intellectual tools as instruments. Reconnecting the life world of European citizens requires so much more than endless polls. Our understanding of the European integration process can greatly gain from mind work and from field work, stemming from disciplines such as anthropology or sociology, which are concerned with the aspirations and visions of the world and daily practices of Europeans, and whose theorizations are grounded in fieldwork research. And the humanities, too, have also so much to contribute. Obviously history, but also subjects such as literature, linguistics, or philology, a discipline that can help us unpack the sedimentation of meanings that are there in the European languages, themselves influenced by both the protagonists and the victims of empires. And we should not forget the courage of thinkers in their time, such as Diderot, Kant, or Herder, who sought an enlightenment without empire. An adequate discourse, able to deliver a Europe of the citizens, is one that would include the capacities and goals which, in the eyes of European citizens, render human life worth living. A discourse that would discuss, as I have said, the nature of good work, which is a question very different from the issue of labour force flexibility or mobility. A discourse that would let the poor and the unemployed of Europe speak is and will be the test of our authenticity. As Theodor Adorno said, the need to let suffering speak is the condition of all truth. European citizens have made it very clear, indeed precedent, that they are awaiting and are ready for a new substantive agenda for the European Union. They are willing, with adequate invitation, and when presented with challenging alternatives, to take part in the crafting of this new agenda. Jürgen Habermas put it very clearly when he said in his most recent interview, the agenda which recklessly prioritizes shareholder interests and is indifferent to increasing social inequality, to the emergence of an underclass, to child poverty, to a low-wage sector, has been discredited. So the challenge, therefore, is to craft a public discourse in which all citizens, not just the most expert or the most mobile among them, will be allowed to take part. And for this to happen, government and the markets must, I suggest, be made amenable to the tribunal of everyday justificatory discourse. Marfockel to conclude, just on one issue, the question of language itself. It seems to me that the current obsession with calculability, with measurement, is cutting off the possibility in so many ways of a connection with the European demos as it might come to be. I argued in my introduction against the disproportionate influence, for example, of rating agencies that I describe as our postmodern panopticon in informing European policy responses to the crisis, and I believe that it is undermining the role of citizens in governing our democracies. The relationship between peoples is not, in the end, reducible to the calculus. In the face of what could be described then as a form of extreme reductionism, a reduction to the de-peopled medium of credit ratings and narrowly calculated growth rates, I would like to contrast the virtues of democratic deliberations, the power of full-blown conversations between Europeans, and may I plead as well for the nurturing of multilingualism in Europe. European citizens all have a native tongue, and one or several languages of communication, usually English nowadays. Some of them also have a language of choice. I profoundly believe that the most precious is that third one. It is the language through which we can express something additional, which is not given in a vernacular language. A chosen language allows you to better appreciate a chosen country, a chosen place, a chosen people. Without the languages of other Europeans, we deprive ourselves of the possibility of genuinely and deeply understanding one another, of thoroughly apprehending our common past, sustaining a rich conversation as to our possible futures. So if I could formulate my last wish then for our future as Europeans, it would be the following. Intra ante ipsum, return from exteriority. We have renounced conquest and can start interiorizing space and endeavor to turn the space of the other into our space, not through appropriation, but through mutual listening, through dialogue and reading, through memorization. These are, I suggest, meaningful ways of not merely communicating Europe, but of communicating as Europeans. Muchísimas gracias.